guys, it's Courtney, and today I am bringing back some old school techniques in a collaboration with two wonderful, talented ladies, which I'll talk more about in a minute. And I'm going to be using the Gina K. Santana Rose stamp set. Starting off with a piece of Nina Desert Storm, and I have my scoreboard here, and I'm scoring every ½ inch. You can make these lines as far apart or as close together as you want. And my background is going to be an ink swiping. So I have my vintage photo distress ink, which if any of you guys have been crafting a while, you know that that was probably the first distress ink that you ever purchased. Everything had vintage photo on it. So I'm just swiping my ink pad right along that panel, and I'm going to do both sides just so that you can see the embossed side and the debossed side. I think that's the word, debossed. Well, that's what we're going to call it. So you can really use either side. It kind of looks like wood grain, and that's going to be our background. Went ahead and put that aside, and next I'm going to take another piece of Nina Desert Storm, and I'm going to go ahead and stamp out my image. And this is a lot larger than I thought it was for some reason, but I went ahead and stamped this out with dark chocolate ink by Simon Says Stamp. I wanted a dark brown, but I also wanted something that was Copic safe, and the Simon Says Stamp dye inks are Copic safe. So I did stamp that twice, like I said, huge image, and we are going to color this with our Copic markers. So I'm not doing any kind of complex coloring here. I'm basically just adding my shading. When you're coloring on colored cardstock, or in this case, the Desert Storm cardstock, you want to keep in mind that the background or the color of the cardstock is going to slightly show through. So you may want to use a little bit darker of colors than you normally would, because it's going to be toned down a little bit, if that makes any sense. So I did the first petal and I just wasn't liking it. So I ended up using some flicking motions. At first I wasn't going to, but ended up adding a few little flicks here and there just to bring out my shadows a little bit. Now, I am going to show you the coloring of the entire rose. However, I'm not going to go into detail here. You can pretty much see what I'm doing here. Where one petal is coming out from another, that's going to be the darkest areas. Now, most of these petals have a lot of line detail to them. I'm ignoring them. And for this card, I'm ignoring them. This would be a great stamp set for no line coloring if you want to practice no line coloring, because all of the details and all of the texture within each one of these petals is there, and it will kind of guide you as far as where you need to put your shadows. So it is a great stamp set if you want to kind of teach yourself no line coloring. So you'll see that I started with one petal at a time. Now I'm kind of working on multiples because I get bored coloring the same thing and I'm not doing any kind of detailed coloring. So I kind of just kept it pretty simple. So as you can see, I'm using the E50 markers, and typically I go in with my lightest color first to get the paper saturated and to map out my darkest areas. In this case, I already know what my darkest areas are going to be, and I don't know how safe this paper is for Copic coloring. It can hold quite a bit of ink, but I want to try to avoid any bleeding. So I'm going right in with my darkest color to avoid oversaturating the paper and risk it bleeding. So let me go on as I'm coloring this rose and doing the same thing over and over. I'll talk to you a little bit about the collaboration. So this month I am collaborating with Renee from Delaney Jane Cards and Amanda from Rise and Procrastinate. These are two YouTubers that are fairly new to YouTube, but have been crafting a very long time. They're very, very, very talented, and they collaborate once a month. They have a different theme that they collaborate on, and they were so very generous and gracious to ask me to collaborate, or allow me. Let me put it that way. I kind of invited myself. So they allowed me to collaborate with them this month, and I will link both of their channels and both of their videos for this collaboration in the description box below. So I encourage you to go check out their channels if you haven't already done so. They are super talented. So you can see that I'm just finishing up these larger petals here. And once you get to the middle of the rose, or really the middle of any kind of flower that has a ton of petals, like a rose, like a peony, or something along those lines, it kind of becomes a little confusing once you get to the middle. You have some petals that are kind of bowing out. You have some that are kind of folded in towards the center, and it can be a little confusing. don't stress it. Don't stress it. Put your shadows wherever you want, because I can guarantee that when you look at it as a whole, you're not going to be able to tell, or at least the recipient is not going to be able to tell which petal is going in which direction. So don't stress it too much. I laid down my darkest color where I believe the darkest areas would be. You often have kind of folds within the petals as you get closer to the center as well. I always try to add a little bit of a shadow there so that you can kind of tell the shape of the petal. But like I said, don't stress yourself out about the center of the petal, the center of the flower. That always seems to be the hardest, and they're tiny. So it's very hard to get all of your colors in there. In a lot of cases, I don't. I'm not able to fit all 4 colors in these tiny petals. So what I typically do is I go in with my darkest and usually my lightest mid-tone and possibly my lightest if I have room. And that way I still get the contrast with using less markers. So once the rose was completely done, I wanted to kind of keep with the vintage-y look, or the kind of like the neutral look, I guess you can say. So for the leaves, I ended up bringing in a different color combination, but I'm sticking with the E markers because, like I said, I want everything to kind of be browns and neutral tones. So once again, I am going to go right in with the darkest color, which will be the E79. And I'm not doing any kind of special shading to this at all. I am just adding a little bit of shading to the center of the leaf and kind of going up towards the center and then blending that out each time. Now, the second leaf is kind of tucked behind this first one, so I did add a little bit of a shadow there, but otherwise I colored all of these the same. None of them are folded. None of them have any kind of different texture to them. They're all pretty much the same. And like I said, I kept all of the coloring very, very simple. So once all of my coloring was complete, we're going to go ahead and cut down all of our panels. Like I said, if you guys have been crafting a long time, you'll remember the day before there was stitched rectangle dies and all these fancy dies. We just cut our panels straight. So that's exactly what I'm doing here. I am cutting down the panel for the rose just a little bit larger than the rose itself and realized it was still a little too big. So I cut it even closer to those leaves. The tips of the leaves are basically right on the edge of my card panel. Next, I wanted to add, I also cut down the panel that's kind of have that fake wood grain, and I cut that 1/4 of an inch on the one side and an 1/8 of an inch on the top and the bottom, so that where that ink starts, where it's kind of the darkest, it kind of remains the darkest. I did end up adding just a little bit more to make it a little bit more seamless, being I had cut off a chunk of it. And I'm also going to do some ink blending directly on the panel with the rose. Now, back in the day, we used ink blending tools, and not even the round ones. Those are the mini ink blending tools. Back in the day, we had rectangle ink blending tools, and I don't have those anymore, but I do have the round ones, and I wish I would have brought that out, but instead I grabbed a blending brush, which worked fine, but I think I would have gotten a better result if I used a regular ink blending tool. But all I'm really doing is going around the edges. You can see I'm working on a scrap piece of paper, and I'm starting on that scrap piece of paper and bringing my ink in. So I'm concentrating my edges being the darkest, and then I'll kind of just blend that directly towards the center of the panel. I'm not worried about going over my coloring. It's not going to change the look of it or anything. I just want to give this a more aged or distressed vintagey look. And this was all the rage back several years ago. Everybody did this to every card. Every card had a vintage look to it. So once that was done, we are going to go ahead and cut the remaining panels that we're going to be using here. So I'm cutting a piece of kind of like a cream colored cardstock. And honestly, I have no idea what brand this is, but I didn't have any dark brown cardstock. I very rarely buy colored cardstock other than like black and craft. So I'm taking one of those Copic markers and I'm just coloring the edges, all 4 sides of these panels. That way it'll look as if I used dark brown cardstock, but I don't have to drive myself crazy trying to dig through my stash to find any. So I also cut another piece of the cream colored cardstock a little bit larger than the one that we colored with that Copic marker, and also using that same cream cardstock for the card base. So I'm going to go ahead and layer the rose panel onto that colored piece that looks like brown cardstock, and then onto the cream colored cardstock. Now for the wood grain, I'm just going to call it wood grain. I'm going to layer that onto the brown cardstock or fake brown cardstock, and then onto that cream colored card panel. That way I have a little bit of each color showing. And again, this is what we did back in the day. We layered and layered and layered. So next I wanted to go ahead and stamp out the sentiment. So I'm using a sentiment from that same stamp set, using that same dark chocolate ink and stamping this onto another piece of the Nina Desert Storm. And then I'm going to trim this down into pretty small strip. And this is actually going to go sideways and kind of tucked behind, or appear to be tucked behind, my focal image. Which again, this is something that Gina K used to do all the time. And she is the reason why I'm card making, and she is the reason why I learned all those techniques, because she had videos all the time, and she really, really taught you how to do things. So that was blending in way too much with the background. So I took another scrap piece of that cream cardstock and just layered that sentiment on there, and just left a little bit of a border on the top portion of the sentiment and on either side, because the rest is going to be tucked behind the focal image anyway. So next I can adhere everything together. Going to use my Tombow Mono Multi Glue again. That way I have a couple of seconds to shift things around if needed. And I just tucked that sentiment directly, or appeared as if it's kind of tucked behind my focal image. Last, I added a little bit of shimmer just to the rose with a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen. This was just looking a little too vintagey for me, and I needed a little shimmer. But that is it. That is the card for today. I want to thank Renee and Amanda for letting me join in their collaboration this month. As always, I will leave the supplies listed in the description box below, along with the links to Renee's and Amanda's channel. Thank you guys so much for stopping by today, and have a great day. Bye.